In 1947, a man moved to one of the most remote islands in Scotland. No electricity, no running hot water, miles from the nearest doctor. He was already sick. He knew it, and he went anyway, because he had a book to finish. A book he believed the world needed more than he needed to stay alive. That man was George Orwell. The book was 1984. And what almost no one talks about is this. He wrote most of it while his lungs were failing, while he was coughing up blood, while the doctors told him, quietly but clearly, that he was running out of time. This is not a story about a dystopian novel. This is a story about a man who made a decision, a specific, almost irrational decision, to spend whatever life he had left on a warning. A warning for you, for all of us. Let's go back to where this really starts. By 1945, Orwell had already survived more than most people face in a lifetime. He'd been shot through the throat fighting in the Spanish Civil War. He'd lived in poverty so deep he wrote a book about it. He'd watched political idealism curdle into totalitarianism across Europe, and he'd tried to tell people, through journalism, through essays, through Animal Farm, and for years, almost nobody listened. Animal Farm was rejected by 4 publishers. One of them said it was impossible to sell animal stories in wartime. Another worried it would offend the Soviet Union, Britain's wartime ally. The book that would eventually sell more than 11 million copies was nearly strangled at birth. But something else happened in 1945 that changed everything. Something personal. Something that broke Orwell in a way that politics and war never quite managed. His wife died. Eileen Blair, she kept her own name, died on the operating table during a routine surgery. She was 39. Orwell wasn't there. He was in Europe reporting for a newspaper. He came home to an empty flat and a son who wasn't yet 2 years old. Orwell never fully spoke about what Eileen's death did to him. He wasn't that kind of man. But people who knew him said he was never quite the same after March 1945. Something closed off. Something that had been held together by her presence simply stopped being held together. He kept working. That was his way. He always kept working. But now the work had a different quality, a different urgency, like a man who has stopped believing he has infinite time. By late 1946, Orwell had the core idea for what would become 1984. He'd been circling it for years, the totalitarian state, the erasure of truth, the boot stamping on the human face forever. But now he wanted to write it properly, fully, without compromise. The problem was London, the literary world, the journalism, the social obligations, the damp and the noise. It was all pulling him away from the work. And his health was deteriorating. The tuberculosis that had likely been in his body for years was beginning to announce itself more loudly. So Orwell made a decision that, in retrospect, seems either visionary or insane depending on how you look at it. He decided to move to Jura. Jura is a Scottish island in the Inner Hebrides. It's roughly the size of a small county, and in the late 1940s it had a population of around 250 people. Getting there required a train to Glasgow, another train further north, a ferry, a bus, another ferry, and then, if you were going to Barnhill, the farmhouse where Orwell was headed, another 8 miles of unpaved road. There was no phone at Barnhill, no electricity. The nearest doctor was on the mainland. In winter, the island was routinely cut off for weather for days at a time. Orwell moved there in the spring of 1946 with his young son Richard and his sister Avril to help run the house. He was 42 years old, already underweight, already coughing. His friends in London thought he was making a serious mistake. He didn't disagree with them exactly. He just went anyway. And here is what nobody tells you about those years on Jura. Orwell was happy there, not in a comfortable, easy way, in a stripped-down, clarified way. He grew vegetables, he fished, he chopped wood, he taught Richard to do things with his hands. The island gave him something London couldn't: silence. And in the silence, the book began to take shape. He started writing the first full draft of 1984 in the autumn of 1946. But the winter nearly killed him. By December 1946, Orwell was seriously ill. His left lung had become infected. He was running a fever. The isolation that felt liberating in summer felt different now, dangerous, almost punishing. He was eventually taken to a hospital on the mainland and spent weeks recovering. He went back to Jura in the spring. He always went back. By summer 1947, he was writing obsessively, thousands of words a week, sometimes more. He knew that tuberculosis was active. He knew he was pushing his body past what it could reasonably sustain. He said so in letters to friends, matter-of-factly, almost clinically, the way he said everything. "I think I have given myself away badly by trying to do too much." He kept writing. And then, in August 1947, something happened that had nothing to do with the book and yet somehow belongs to this story completely.
Orwell took Richard and some friends out on a small boat near the waters near Jura. They were trying to reach a nearby island. To get there, they had to navigate around a stretch of water called the Korivrekan, one of the largest tidal whirlpools in the world. They mistimed the tide. The whirlpool caught them. The outboard motor was torn off the boat itself capsized. Orwell, his young son, and the others were thrown into the water cold enough to kill in minutes. They managed to reach a small rocky outcrop. They waited there, soaked and freezing, until a passing lobster boat spotted them and pulled them out. Orwell nearly drowned in the waters off Jura with the unfinished manuscript of 1984 waiting for him on his desk. He mentioned it in a letter as though it were a minor inconvenience. By the end of 1947, the first draft was complete. It had taken him almost exactly a year of relentless, physically punishing work. He sent it to his agent, and then, finally, agreed to go to a sanatorium. The diagnosis was confirmed: bilateral tuberculosis, both lungs. The doctors were not optimistic. Orwell spent the first half of 1948 at Hairmyres Hospital in Scotland. He received treatment. He improved, slowly. And even from his hospital bed, even during the worst of it, he was editing, revising, refining. He was discharged in July 1948 and went back to Barnhill, back to Jura, back to the book. He had rewritten the entire novel by November 1948. He typed the final manuscript himself because he couldn't find a typist willing to travel to Jura, and he was too ill to travel to one. He sat at his typewriter, hands that were increasingly difficult to control, and typed nearly 125,000 words. When he finished, he could barely get out of bed. His publisher received the manuscript in December 1948. 1984 was published in June 1949. It was an immediate sensation, reviewed everywhere, debated everywhere, translated almost immediately into multiple languages. George Orwell never left the hospital again. He died in January 1950, 7 months after his book came out. He was 46 years old. Here is the thing that stays with you when you learn all of this, when you understand what it actually cost him. Orwell knew he was dying when he went to Jura. Not in a vague, abstract way. He knew. The doctors had told him years earlier that his lungs were compromised. He understood what prolonged physical labor in a cold, damp, isolated farmhouse would do to someone in his condition. He went anyway. He wrote anyway. And this is the part people miss when they read 1984 as a political text, as a philosophical exercise, as a piece of literary analysis. The book is all of those things, but it is also something more intimate than that. It is a man's last argument, written at full speed, at full force, in full knowledge that he was running out of time to make it. The urgency you feel when you read it, that relentless, suffocating pressure, isn't just a stylistic choice. It is the texture of a dying man's mind. A man who believed that if he didn't say this clearly and completely, then something essential might be lost, might be forgotten, might be allowed to happen. Winston Smith's terror is real because Orwell's terror was real. The Ministry of Truth erasing the past is real because Orwell had watched, in Spain and in the Soviet Union and in the propaganda of wartime Britain, how easily the past could be rewritten.
Big Brother watching everything is real, because Orwell understood, viscerally, from experience, how power protects itself. He had one chance to say all of this as fully as he possibly could. He used it. Here is the fact you will think about tonight. Orwell finished typing the manuscript of 1984 in a condition so dire that friends who visited him at Barnhill in those final months said he looked like a ghost, a man already halfway gone. He could barely walk from one room to another, and yet every day he sat at that typewriter and he worked. The last line of the novel, you know it. He loved Big Brother. It is one of the most devastating endings in the history of literature. A human being completely destroyed by a system designed to destroy human beings. Winston's last freedom, his ability to resist, finally extinguished. Orwell wrote that line while his own body was extinguishing him. Make of that what you will. 1984 didn't make Orwell rich in time for it to matter. It didn't save him. What it did, what he chose deliberately at the cost of whatever years he might have had left, was tell the truth as loudly and as clearly as he possibly could. If you've read this book, you already carry part of what he was trying to give you. If you haven't, now you know what it cost. What does it mean that one of the most important warnings of the 20th century was written by a man who knew he wouldn't survive to see its impact? Leave your answer in the comments. I read every one of them. And if this is the kind of story you want to keep hearing, the real story, the human story behind the books that changed everything, subscribe. There are more of these. There always are.